The equipment you choose must be easy to use, not get in your way, and be able to handle the abuse that normally occurs. After some embarrassing accidents, my son came up with the perfect camera for a klutz like me.
Just a brief note about sensor size. While there are engineering advantages to smaller chips, portrait photographers want physically larger sensors. The reason is for shallower depth of field. This can be accomplished only two ways, through f-stop and image size on the focal plane. Amateur cameras with their tiny chips have enormous depth of field, leading to busy backgrounds. Portrait professionals must use cameras with larger sensors to give us the option of shallow depth of field, even though those cameras are considerably more expensive than cameras with smaller chips having a magnification factor, or more accurately, a crop factor. Here's a chart to show the relationships between the various cameras and their sensor sizes. This factors into noise and depth of field.
So how does depth of field relate to sensor size?
Let's say we want to blur the paper hanging on the refrigerator in the background. Shooting with a full frame camera at f4 achieves that. But a smaller chip camera can't do that as well at f4. We would need to open up the lens to a wider aperture to achieve the same depth of field. But what if your lens only goes to f4? That's the problem with smaller chip cameras. In case you're wondering about using an APS sensor camera and you want the same shallow depth of field as a full frame camera, basically the ratio is dependent on the ratio of the sensor sizes. So for a sensor 2/3 the size of a full frame sensor, you have to open up about 2/3 of a stop. Now let's say we're using a zoom lens and we've got a lot of little details in the background. Even though we have the lens already wide open, shooting at the short end of a zoom range could make the result a busy background. But backing up and zooming in narrows the field of view, resulting in enlarged background details. This helps to separate the subject from the background busyness. Remember, the depth of field stayed the same because we kept the subject the same size on the sensor.
While we're on the topic of depth of field, this is proof that depth of field is not determined by focal length. This image was shot at 200 mm at f2.8.
This was photographed at 16 mm and f2.8. Note that the cows in the back have the same degree of sharpness. So depth of field is determined by image sensor size and f-stop, not the focal length of the lens. I know this can be confusing, but whenever you're in doubt, just remember it's all about the image size at the camera's focal plane. Bigger image means less depth of field. Smaller image means more depth of field. By the way, back in 1987 I was curious about all this, and I calculated it to show that focal length does not appreciably affect depth of field. The sensor on phones is really small, so the depth of field is really deep, even though the f-stop on the cell phone is f2.8. Cell phone cameras have a simulated bokeh effect. It's okay, but of course not as accurate as the real bokeh a larger camera system generates. Just as a comparison, here's a similar result from a DSLR. Naturally, this is superior in every way to that old iPhone. Cell phones can do marvelous things, but they can't compete with a high-quality professional camera. And if that's not shallow enough depth of field, You can make it smaller by shooting close to the subject, then shooting around the subject. When you put all those exposures together, you end up with a shallower depth of field than you would have if you'd have backed up to get the whole scene. In case you're interested to know the effective focal length and f-stop for this kind of image, you can use this website to calculate it for you. So what do you do when your lens isn't fast enough to throw the background out of focus? Shooting at f4, the background here was too distracting. The best way I've found to fix it is to first select the subject and make a separate layer of just her. Then you have to clone the background into where she was. Next, you'll need to run Photoshop Lens Blur on the bottom layer, and remember to blur areas more that would be farther away. Then bring the layer with her back in and flatten it. Yeah, it's a heck of a lot of work. It would be much easier just to open up your lens all the way, or buy a lens with a wider aperture that gives you a shallower depth of field.
Shallow depth of field is not always needed. Let's talk about the times where it is.
With a short, small aperture lens, the leaves in the background would have been too distracting because with a full-length pose, we need to be far from the subject, causing a deep depth of field. A long, wide aperture lens was the best way to handle that problem.
When shooting a full-length image from far away, lenses will have a long depth of field. So if this were done at f4 or smaller, the busy background would have been distracting. Shooting the 200mm lens at f2 sufficiently blurred that background. By the way, cropping into the face on that same image, you can see that this lens is sharp. I'll use a tripod when necessary, but for these around town images, I'd prefer to be more mobile. At f4, this image is okay, but the busy background fights for attention. At f2, however, she's nicely separated from all that busyness behind her. With half-length poses like this, we're getting a nice benefit from an f2 lens. But it isn't always necessary to use a fast lens.
The background is fairly far from the subject, which helps, but it's bright, busy, and distracting. If we're far from the subject and we use a shorter focal length lens, the cluttered background will compete with the subject. But if we zoom in on the subject, that bright, busy background turns to mush, and we get a nice separation for the subject.
The larger the person is in the image, the less we need to open up. While I like this at f2, I like this one with the lens stopped down too. So when I'm shooting close-ups with my zoom, I don't mind working in an area with a cluttered background. Focusing on a close subject will throw the background way out of focus anyway. This was where I shot all of that. As you can see, if I had stopped down further on any of those, it would have been unacceptably busy.
I drove 2 hours to get to the senior's house and did this. Well, that background could have been done anywhere. Luckily, I also photographed the background like this, a little bit out of focus. So I was able to mask the two together to make a sandwich with the background more in focus than I originally photographed it.
When detail in the background is important, it doesn't help to shoot a shallow depth of field. Stopping the lens down to a smaller f-stop brings more of the wet, dewy grass into view.
And while this is nice, I liked the background, but using a shallow depth of field f-stop blocks our view of it. So I stopped down the lens to be able to get a better appreciation of that beautiful background.
In this photo, the background is very nice, and although I prefer a mid amount of depth of field, I'll show a series of f-stops so you can be the judge of which would be optimal. But the point is that if the background is already nice, you might want to stop down a bit from wide open to see it.
There's some confusion over the term bokeh. Basically, bokeh is the look of out-of-focus details. With shallower depth of field, there's more of it. And with a longer focal length lens, there's more magnification of the background, which enlarges the bokeh. So bokeh is the look of the out-of-focus area due to the shallow depth of field and magnification. Bokeh is also somewhat affected by the internal construction of the lens, in that two lenses of the same focal length and aperture can exhibit different bokeh. It's possible to artificially blur the background with Photoshop lens blur, but how does that compare to real bokeh with a fast lens? The problem is that blurring in Photoshop smears everything, and with real bokeh, some parts of the background have a different appearance than simply mushing it all out.